Hello, I'm Hiroshi Hori.
And I'm Kunio Ogawa.
It's been quite a while since we've appeared together like this. I've just returned from 3 weeks under the broiling sun in West Africa. Got back just in time for the final game of the All-Japan High School Baseball Tournament, only to realize that here's a country where summer goes out with a baseball tournament as the major concern. It impressed me because the papers in Africa and Europe featured the labor dispute in our neighboring country, South Korea.
It looks like the Emperor's scheduled visit to Okinawa this fall is an event that will attract great attention. I think this will give us an opportunity to think about World War II in the Pacific as well as Okinawa itself. Today we have an unusual episode from the Battle of Okinawa.
In the final days of the Battle of Okinawa, the only place on Japanese soil where ground fighting took place, many civilians became the victims of the heavy fighting, which lasted for 3 months. Recently, it was learned that in between battles, American and Japanese soldiers held a luncheon meeting on a small island. This is a report on a hidden episode of the Battle of Okinawa, how it came about, and what was discussed in that luncheon meeting. Some 22 miles to the west of Naha City in Okinawa is an island called Akajima, near the center of the Keramas, made up of 15 large and small islands. This is where it all happened. Akajima is a small island, some 7 miles in circumference, with a population of 200. It is a popular year-round resort for divers. It abounds with nature. In fact, one can occasionally catch a glimpse of the Kerama deer, which has been designated as a natural monument. The first guns in the Battle of Okinawa were fired here on this beautiful island 42 years ago. The U.S. forces landed on Akajima in the closing days of the Pacific Campaign on March 26, 1945, and on the main island of Okinawa on April 1st. And for the next 3 months, there continued the only ground battle fought on Japanese soil in the course of World War II. It was a gruesome battle, one which has been described in U.S. military history as a battle that resembled a collection of hells in a single place.
Blood and bits of human flesh came flying at us. Along with the bullets screaming past us, a rain of blood and human flesh fell from the sky. After I was injured, I could no longer feed my baby or even hold him, and he died, lying on a rock. I said to him, "Mother will be coming soon. Wait for me."
Amidst the intense fighting, one by one, the surrounding islands were occupied by the advancing U.S. troops. Yet Akajima alone managed to survive until the end of the war. Although it was the site of the first landing by the U.S. forces, how did this island manage to escape occupation? What happened on this little island? We found the key to solve that mystery in the National Record Center, located in the suburbs of Washington, where a large volume of records concerning World War II are kept. Masatoshi Uehara, a journalist who lives in Okinawa, found a copy of a classified report. And this is the report. Described are the details of the attack on Akajima. It was written on July 13, 1945, just prior to the end of the war. The report, much to our surprise, says in part, American and Japanese soldiers met over a luncheon of roast pork and even prayed together. In May of this year, the survivors and families visited Akajima to pray for those who lost their lives there. The Japanese troops stationed on Akajima at the time were the second garrison of the Maritime Volunteer Corps of the Japanese Imperial Army. They numbered around 350, including reinforcements. Their mission was, in short, special seaborne attacks. They were a suicide squad designed to board and operate vessels called marure, specially prepared to ram U.S. ships. The special attack boats, in fact, were made by pasting together sheets of plywood. There still remain a number of dugouts all around the island which were used to hide these boats. The commander of the Special Seaborne Attack Squad was Major Yoshihiko Noda. Yoshihiko Noda, who now lives in a modest public apartment in Tokyo, was a young man of 26 at the time. As garrison commander on Akajima, Noda, representing the Japanese side, took part in the discussion with the U.S. troops.
アメリカ軍っていうのは非常に人道的っていうかね、まあ、戦ってるお互い軍人だっていう意識もあっただろうけれども、まあ、非常に人道的に接してくれたということだよね。
To find out just how Noda agreed to the meeting, we have to go back to the beginning of the battle on Akajima. The American troops landed on Akajima Island at shortly past 8 on the morning of March 26, 1945. The sea around Akajima Island was swarming with U.S. ships.
どれだけいるか分かりませんけどもね、分からなかったんですけども、とにかくまあ海岸の近くから水平線の先までね、真っ黒になってこう船が見えましたね。とにかくまあなんて言いますかね、一晩の間にものすごいでっかい島ができたみたいなね、それほど海が真っ黒になってみたいですね。
みんながこう6列か8列に並んで島に向かって走ってきたんだ。こうそれを見ながら向こうに行け、沖縄本当に行け、沖縄本当に行け、本当そう思ったあの時は。巡洋艦が撃ったら山が揺れるよ。外から23日の大砲で撃ち込まれたら島が揺れるんだから。
With the U.S. troops about to land, Noda's men were prepared to die and sent Army headquarters the following telegraph. Troops protecting Akajima will fight bravely till the last man and offer the supreme sacrifice. 0800 hours, March 26, 1945.
その玉砕電報を撃った時にはもうこれまでと。しかし私はここでね、惨めな死に方はしないから、立派なここで戦死をするから、喜んでくれという気持ちでですね、そして玉砕電報を撃ったわけですな。
Later, the U.S. troops began to focus their attack on Okinawa Island, and the fighting around Akajima came to a standstill. But in June, something unexpected happened.
そう6月の中旬の時にですよね、アメリカの発動艇が海岸からちょっと先100メーターぐらいのところにこう止まりましてね、で突然その日本語で放送を始めたんですよ。皆さんも無理な戦闘をやって死なないようにしてくださいというふうなことをね、丁寧な言葉で言いましたね。
本土の方で聴いておった子供の時に歌われた唱歌のようなもの、それから村の鍛冶屋なんていうのは非常に懐かしい曲を流しながらですね、皆さんこの戦争は大変なこと、もうダメですから出てきなさいというふうな呼びかけがですね、 あったのと、
Every day, the Americans called on the Japanese troops to surrender, and among the messages were some specifically addressed by name to the Japanese troops entrenched in the hills. The U.S. report on the engagement reads like this. An aggressive program of broadcasting personal messages was launched, which called out to persons known by the POWs, recalling incidents of home life.
私が聞いた時には間違いなく日本人の声だなというふうに思いましたね。これはやはりそうではないね、純正日本人って言いますかね、日本の日本人の喋り方だなと思いましたからね。
According to the U.S. report, the man enlisted to call on the Japanese troops to surrender was the 2nd Lieutenant Someya, who was a prisoner of the U.S. troops. After the war, Lieutenant Someya severed all contact with his wartime associates. He would not even indicate his return address in letters to his former comrades. He even changed his name. We were finally able to trace Mr. Someya. He had belonged to Noda's unit, but had surrendered when the U.S. troops landed on Akajima Island.
ごめんください。TBS の様子なんですけど。投降勧告に船で染谷さんが行きますね。その時はどんな気分だったですか。
どんな気分ってあんたはもう無駄な死に方するなっていうことですわ。もう今となった段階ではね、はっきり言うてね、勝つ見込みなんて全然ないんだと。だから皆さんにも家族があるでしょうと、将来もあるでしょうと、自重せないけませんと。
The U.S. report has the following notation.
Included in these POWs was a Japanese second lieutenant named Someya Masayuki, one of those rare progressive thinkers among the Japanese forces.
そう呼びかけながらですね、日本軍に対する後ろめたさのようなものはありましたか。
ありませんね。私は信念に基づいて動いてる。絶対ない。それはむしろ誇りぐらいに思ってますわ。ただし分からずがいますからね、全く。そういう連中はどう受けたかは私知りませんよ。私自身は正しいと信じてる、今でも。
For this operation, the U.S. troops formed a special team and used every method possible to arrange a meeting with Major Noda. On one occasion, they set up 3 white flags on the beach and left a message for Major Noda. Finally, Major Noda decided to agree to a meeting, but first gathered the islanders and his troops to deliver instructions.
我々はもう会談はただ状況しに私が行くだけだと。もう我々は日本が上の方から降伏してよろしい、降伏せろという命令が来るまでは戦うと。ただ村の人が一番心配だったわけだ。
野田さんの訓示というのはどういう内容だったんですか。
米軍に降伏したい人は降伏するように、その代わりここに残る友軍がいるので、その友軍に発見されたらそれは軍律として見たからには撃たざるを得ないので、その残る友軍に見つからないように要領よく山を降りていくようにと言われてですね。
After instructing the islanders that they were free to surrender, Major Noda and his men were ready for their meeting with the U.S. troops. It was the morning of June 26, 1945.
野田さんが準備して一生懸命やっていることもすぐ僕らの小屋の方からすぐ見えましたし、準備がですね、その向こう行く服装ですね、それを整えておったんですね。で普段はああいうふうな清掃しませんですがね、普段の軍服ですが、あの時にはもうちゃんとした新しいものと着替えてですね、それからいよいよ本当に会いに行かれるんだなというふうにして僕も非常に興奮したんですが、あの時には
Carrying a rising sun flag to signal that they would agree to a meeting, Major Noda and his men started down the mountain to the beach.
私の前には私の当番の小山がほら機関短銃ピストルの弾を軽機関銃みたいにトントントンと撃つやつを抱えてその後ろに私がついて私の後ろにはほら小野田総長だとか兵隊たちが何列かにずっと縦に長く並んで近づいて海岸に近づくとみんなこう広げて静かに近づいて隠しちゃったわけね。
The Japanese troops who were covering Noda and his group hid in the nearby grass and watched the progress of the talks, prepared for the worst. Second Lieutenant Someya was on the beach, together with his U.S. captors, waiting for the Japanese rising sun flag to appear.
日の丸が向こうから降りてくるのをご覧になりました？
見ました。粛々として降りてきたりさ。その時はもうその時すでにもうこれは階段成立と。階段はね、うまいこといくだろうと思ったんですよ。第一巻ね。おそらく削れる積むなら降りてきませんからね。そうは思ってたんですよ。
In this manner, a meeting between Japanese and U.S. officers unprecedented in the history of the war in the Pacific was about to be held. Waiting on the beach for Major Noda were some 10 American soldiers who had come to take part in the meeting. How did the discussion proceed, and what were the results? We succeeded in locating the American soldiers who were there on that day. A stretch of sand at one end of Akajima is known by the islanders as Utaha Beach. It was here that Major Yoshihiko Noda and his men met and held a discussion with the U.S. soldiers. What was discussed at that meeting, and what was the atmosphere like? To find out, we spoke with Lieutenant Colonel Clark, who headed the operation. Clark, now 88 years old, says he remembers the Akajima Island conference as if it were yesterday.
So we knew that we were going to be surrounded by Japanese troops when we went in there. Yeah. And we also knew that we would be heavily outnumbered and that we wouldn't really have a chance if they got nasty about it. But they didn't. They were gentlemen, and I will never forget the kindness that they extended to us.
And the man who worked under Colonel Clark and the one who actually carried out the operation was Lieutenant David Osborne. After the war, Osborne spent a number of years in Japan as a minister resident at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and is well known among the political and financial circles. He is now involved in promoting Japanese language instruction for Americans. He explained how he hit upon the idea of this unusual operation.
染谷さんからその赤島の部隊のことを聞いてですね、どうもこれもしうまくやればですね、これはあるいは全体で降伏をする可能性があるなと思うようになったですね。そしてできたらこれは大変有意義なことだと思ったんです。
The U.S. side comprised 10 men, including Lieutenant Colonel Clark, Lieutenant Osborne, and a Japanese-American interpreter from Hawaii, Sergeant Robert Oda. The Japanese side consisted of Garrison Commander Major Noda and his adjutant, First Lieutenant Takeda, and some 50 armed men who were hiding behind a ridge, ready for any eventuality. The meeting began on the morning of June 26, 1945. The Japanese soldier on board a U.S. vessel is Major Hiroshi Umezawa. Major Umezawa was a classmate of Major Noda from the military officers' school. Umezawa, a prisoner at the time, had come to persuade his good friend Noda to surrender at the strong request of Lieutenant Colonel Clark.
Got my armor on Umezawa's chest, or shoulders. I was completely in sympathy with his attitude, and poor Umezawa sat there crying. But at the same time, he was listening to our argument about, this being done for the welfare of everybody, including the Japanese. He finally stuck out his hand and he shook hands with me and says, "I go."
A meeting with Mr. Umezawa took place in Osaka. After repeated requests, Mr. Umezawa, who first refused to speak about the Battle of Okinawa, finally agreed to an interview.
あの時ね、そういうようなことは本当自分としてはね、辛かったな。辛かったけども、これは絶対やるべきだと思ったね、俺は。これやらなければね、無駄死にだよな。なんとかして助けたいと。
いよいよそれで会談が始まるわけですね。オズボーンさんの気持ちというのはどんなだったですか？
ウキウキ、緊張ぶり、待ち遠しい、いろいろそういうふうな気持ちだったですよね。
Lieutenant Colonel Clark's party, which landed on Utaha Beach, waited atop the ridge for the rising sun flag to come down the mountainside.
2、3分したら、日の丸が出た。少し時間かかったですね。心配をしておった。
日の丸を見た時は嬉しかったですか？
嬉しかった。はい。そう。いつもならば日の丸見て嬉しくなる兵隊はなかったですけれど、あの自分はちょっと嬉しかったですね。
As the troops of the two armies faced each other, Noda took off his sword and Clark his gun, and both men exchanged salutes.
なるほど。じゃあもうお互い紳士として会ってるということ形ですね。
はい。その時からまあそうですね、初めの間の雰囲気は良くなった。ね。これでは悪いことはないだろうという自信を持てたわけです。
それはもう和やかなもんです。和やかなもんです。それは尊敬も我々も尊敬もしてくれるような態度であるし、見下げたような態度もしませんしね。さすがだなと思いましたな。
So we were just going to sit on this blanket while our conversation went on, and let Umezawa have a place to join in on the conversation. We just told him that we were there to get him to surrender, and told him what our real reason was. That was all. I've already told you what the reason was. Well, I think we had Noda pretty well convinced.
まあ日本はどうせ負けるから結局武装解除を受けたらどうかということだよね。それは私が決めると。私のところには部下もまだおると、村の人もおるから、私一人じゃ決められないっていう。
あんな頑固なことをしても本当に無駄なバカらしいと思ったんですよ。もう僕ね、だから怒ったらしいんだからこんなバカらしいことがあるもんかってね。死んで何のために死ぬ？あれ国のためにもうならないよ。もう戦争はもう終わっとるんだから結局。 でなぜああいう頑固なことをそれだけを僕同じ日本血を持ってもわからないでしょ。
温かい目であんた早くあんたこんなあんた気団に苦しんで部下を困らせてどうするんだっちゅうな、そういうこちらはもうほんまになんちゅうんかな、神さんにおったようななんちゃ敵のような気がしませんでしたかな。
The day wore on. We got close to noontime. And it occurred to me that we were all human beings and we ought to have a little something to eat. Plates and silverware and napkins and tablecloths and everything else spread around there. And so I said to Noda, I said, well, now here's the food. I said, we can't take it up in the hills to you, so just have your people come down and get it. So he told Takeda, and Takeda went over and gave the assembled thing. My gosh, here out of the hills came these.
いやー、私は食べたくなかったんだよ、敵との出す食事。それは我々の方に食料があったら我々の方から送り届けるというのが一つの自分の持ってる占領してる島だもん。攻められてる相手から食料なんか食べさせられていや私も考えたけれどもまあ兵隊たちも腹が減ってるし、まあここで食べればいくらか足しになるだろうっていうくらいだった。
This is what the U.S. report said about the meeting.
There ensued the most amazing spectacle. White folks, black folks, yellow folks, enemies eating roast pork together.
But anyway, he said he wanted more time. Well, I said, I can't give you more time because I am here because I have asked permission from the forces over on Zamami. I have asked their permission to come over here and ask that they cease fire while we're here.
まだ私のところには部下がおると、村の人もおると、私一人では今返事はできないということで、ほらあの会談を打ち切りにしたわけで。
But after the meeting had ended, something happened that astonished the Japanese soldiers. Lieutenant Osborne came climbing up to Major Noda's command post. He was barefoot and unarmed.
そこへあんた一人で上がってくるんだから丸腰で。ほらもう今だにもう驚愕しました。もう何が大和魂ななんて思ったな。アメリカ魂のがもう我々もうはっきり素晴らしいなと思ったね。びっくりしたですわ。
This is near the hilltop command post on Akajima Island, which Lieutenant Osborne visited. Few traces remain. It was here that Lieutenant Osborne relaxed and talked with Major Noda while eating canned pineapple offered by the Japanese officer.
もう少しですね、野田翔さんにですね、その考える余地、考える時間を与えてですね、なんとか気持ちが変えるかもしれないと、ね、考えを変える可能性もあるという考えでしたですよ。
そのために上がっていった。
そうです。
沖縄戦であの人たちとああいう取り扱いをしてくれたというのに感謝するし、本当に見習うべきだと、人間性としてまあ偉いなっていうかね、世界的なまあ考え方であると。
The Americans waited for the reply from Major Noda the next day.
Reply. 1. As long as there are no orders from the Emperor, surrender is impossible. 2. There will be no danger to American military personnel as long as no military activity is involved. 3. We will not interfere with civilians who surrender.
結局もう日本軍の返事が決まってるじゃないまあこれ入れちゃうわけだろうけども、もう天皇陛下の命令が来たらいっぺんで手を挙げる。命令が来ない限りは日本軍は降伏できない。結局そうなるわけです
よ。まあがっかりしたですね。もう確かにこれまだ若いんだからね、考え方が変わるだろうという見込みがあると思ってたんですが、
ダメだった。
これから将来のことを考えな。あなたたちのしかその負けでそのままにしておくんですかいの。あなたたちが若い者が帰って新しい日本を作るのが大きな目的じゃないですか言ってた。
The final answer we got from Noda was that he wouldn't surrender inasmuch as there are no orders from the emperor and so on and so forth. But he agreed to a lot of the things that we had decided were such as using the beach for recreational purposes. He said you may use the beaches for recreational purposes as long as no military activity is involved.
A surrender did not take place, but the meeting did succeed in achieving a partial ceasefire agreement. The Japanese troops would hold their fire if the Americans did not take military action. This resulted in keeping civilian casualties to a minimum. In early August, David Osborne and Robert Oda, the U.S. interpreter at the meeting, arrived in Japan.
Osborne!
The two had come for a reunion with Mr. Noda and the others for the first time in 42 years.
会いますよ。当然もう世話になったことだし、現在は平和だし、私はまああの人たちに感謝をしてるわけだから。
会った時お互いにどんな表情でしょうね。
私は笑ってるだろう。酒ばかり飲んでるから。
一生涯の経験になるだろうと思いますよ。
そうですか。
はい、思い出深い。本当に。
この沖縄の経験というものも忘れることできないですね。
This is Akajima Island, where the U.S.-Japanese meeting took place 42 years ago.
昔はあそこにヤギがいてね。
Mr. Noda and his group arrived in Akajima first to await David Osborne and Robert Oda.
昔は若かったからどんどん飲むとったけど。まで来て中毒してみんな軍艦で囲まれちゃったからな。
の犠牲を払ったのはやはりもちろん広島県民も市民も長崎の人もいたんですけれど、その中で沖縄県民は、それに次ぐぐらいですね、やっぱり大変な大きな犠牲を払ったんです。
Among the exhibits at the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum is a water canteen recovered from the ruins of the Battle of Okinawa 42 years ago. The Battle of Okinawa is the only combat that took place on Japanese soil, and one by one, innocent civilians became the victims of the fighting. Most tragic among them were the members of families who, faced with a threat of a U.S. landing, killed each other in mass suicides.
My mother, after killing the other children and saying, "Let us die," brought a scythe up to my neck. And she said, "If only we had a grenade, we could die quickly." How I wanted to have a grenade.
The man used a club and a rock to kill his wife and child. Screaming, he grabbed his young child by the legs and swung it against a rock over and over again. And when he had finished killing, he swallowed a large amount of rat poison, but did not die. The man, now raving mad, was evacuated by U.S. troops.
Those who had lost their parents or brothers had to try to kill themselves. They would drink poison or try to club each other to death, and sisters would plunge together into flames. Some people would line up and tie a rope around their necks, and those on the right and left would pull the rope. The ones in the middle would die, but those on the side would not. After all, how can someone tighten a rope around his own neck?
Terrifying scenes of mass suicide such as this could be found everywhere.
This それ見たんですから目の前でね女や年寄りや子供でこれはもうこれの中やちょうど写真撮ったみたいなねもうこれは話もできない感じしたんですよ。これだけはもう一生涯僕は忘れないですよ。兵がなくなったらもうこれやむを得んですね互いに。だから住民罪もない人が殺される。これだけはもう一生涯忘れられないですね。これはと。
じゃあ乾杯。
じゃあどうも。
あ、うまい。本日はどうもご苦労さんでした。ありがとうございました。
明日おズボンさんと対面されるわけですけど、
ありがとうございましたっていうね、日本人としては皆さんのおかげでこういう現在たくさんの人が生きているということをお礼を言いたい。本気で攻めたら潰されますよ。なぜ攻めなかったか。
ちょっと気をつけてくださいね。
The next morning, Osborne and Oda headed for Akajima Island. The two will be returning for the first time in 42 years.
これもはっきりと覚えています。はい。面白い格好でしょ。はい。
久しぶりにね思いがけない出会いだったね。
やっぱり昔の 中学の友達だとかまあ日本でいう挨拶になるでしょうね。元気ですかというようなことで。
いやこの会う日を待ってました。何年ぶりで会うことを待っていましたって。あれですね、やっぱし。あれですか。
あそこの海岸ですよ。野田さんですよ。
洋服もちゃんとね。はい、ちょっとね。
大丈夫。
いや、野田さん、わざとお出迎えどうもありがとうございました。
いや、お元気で。遠いところ。
あなたもそうですね。
いや、遠いところ。お元気で。よく来てました。あ、そう。本当に。
懐かしいでしょう、これ。こういう嬉しいことはないでしょう、僕はね。
まだ卒業してませんね。
こんなことしていいかなという気持ちで会談をやったわけですけれども、まあその後まあ全滅させるような攻撃はして、もらえなかったから、それで生き残ってしまったんですよ。
お互いにですね、はい、私もおかげさんで生き残ったわけです。もしね、
ありがとうございます。
野田さんの行為ですね、行為がなかったとすれば私も戦死したかもしれないですね。
そんな騙し討ちはしませんよ。約束したんだから。はい、どうも。
Well, that's the story. Mr. Yoshizaki, how did Akajima Island and Mr. Noda and his troops usher in the end of the war?
Based on the U.S.-Japanese meeting, there was no major fighting on the island during the following 2 months. In fact, 2 months later, on August 23rd, the Japanese troops laid down their arms. They were able to keep casualties to a minimum.
We can imagine the turmoil that Mr. Noda must have felt leading up to the meeting. In fact, considering that strict military regulations at the time, his action can only be described as extreme.
Yes, it was. According to the military code of conduct at the time, he would have deserved to die by firing squad. At the time, Noda was a young man of 26, so it must have been a hard decision on his part. In fact, he first refused to appear on this program. He asked us to discuss it with his former classmates at the military academy, his junior officers and their families before he would agree to talk to us. Perhaps he feels some guilt about having conferred with enemies during the war, and perhaps he felt it was improper for him to appear on television in consideration of the families of the men who served under him who had died in battle.
Well, considering the extent of the tragedy of the Battle of Okinawa, in which so many lives were lost, this episode sounds almost like a small bouquet of flowers. Perhaps its very tenderness serves to emphasize to all of us the bitterness of war. Thank you for watching.